everyone. Welcome to today's Next Gen Women Lead Speaker Series and Pre-Conference Workshop webinar. My name is Ariane Raspak, and I am the Associate Director of Student and Alumni Relations for Forte. Our topic today is negotiations, and you will hear from one of our conference speakers and an expert in this field. But before we get started with our speaker today, I have a few housekeeping items I'd like to review. We will have time for questions toward the end of the webinar, so feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box in the lower right-hand section of the screen at any time. We will wait until the end to answer questions, but feel free to type them in as you think about them. The webinar will be recorded and posted to Forte's webinar page, so if you need to step away, or like to listen to the webinar again later, it will be available to you. At the end of the program, there will be a link to a survey, so please take a moment and provide us with your feedback. And then finally, if you have any technical problems accessing or hearing the webinar, you can use the chat box and send a private message to Jamie, or you can email her as well at jamie@fortefoundation.org at any time during the webinar, and she should be able to assist you. Now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Joyce Russell. She's an expert on negotiations, which is a critical skill for women and men at all career stages. She's the Vice Dean at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland and is responsible for oversight of all of the school's global and domestic programs. Dr. Russell is a licensed industrial and organizational psychologist with extensive applied experiences. She has over 25 years of experiences in consulting with both private and public sector organizations in the areas of leadership and management development, negotiation tactics, executive coaching, and women in management. So Joyce, I'm very happy to have you with us here today, so I will pass the webinar on over to you.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and I'm delighted to be here to conduct this webinar. This is a passion area of mine, and so I'm excited to get started. So what I want to do is I really just want to ensure that all of our attendees leave this session with some practical tips and strategies to help them with their own negotiating skills. Negotiation is a really valuable leadership skill, and so I just want to make sure that we're not just talking about current thinking, but that we're also talking about practice. Now, I should point out the reason that we're doing this is, and the reason I'm so passionate about it, or some would say a zealot, is because women typically do not do very much negotiation as it relates to their jobs or it relates to a lot of things professionally. There's three key findings that the research has pointed out that, and by the way, at the end you'll see where a lot of this research has come from in case you would like to follow up with additional reading. So one of the findings is that women often don't ask for themselves. Women are outstanding at asking for things for other people, particularly their staff or their family members, but they often do not negotiate for themselves. The second thing is that when they do ask, they don't ask for as much as men do. This is particularly true when it comes to salary negotiations or issues associated with jobs, those additional titles or promotion opportunities, etc. And then the third finding is that when women do ask, and we said they don't ask for as much, they're not as persistent. So when sometimes they get a, no, we can't do that, they just give up, as opposed to actually pushing a little bit further and trying to make something happen. So those are the three key findings, that women don't ask, they don't ask for as much, and they're not as persistent. So one of the reasons that we want to do this session is to be able to really help people feel more confident in being able to ask and to ask for the right kind of amount. So I have a number of different tactics that I would suggest, and this is all based on, like I said, the current thinking and research. I'm going to go through these 14 different tactics. I know that seems like a lot, but I just want people to be aware of those. Your goal is, of course, to think about how you might be able to employ these in the situations that you're in. So the first one is that you really have to prepare. Negotiation success is often based on who is the most prepared. So if you think about it, you wouldn't typically just go out and buy a car cold. You would do some research on it. You wouldn't just buy a house cold. You would do some research. Preparation is probably the single biggest thing you can do to support yourself and to build your own confidence so that you feel really great about the negotiation. So what do we need you to prepare as it relates to the job? You need to conduct research on the position. There's a lot of great websites out there that talk about the different types of research that you can do. You need to research the company if you're changing jobs or you're looking to be employed at a particular firm. And one of the things that's really valuable when you're researching the company is look at the financial position of the firm. The last few years, companies have often been able to say, well, you know, we've been in a recession, there's nothing we can do. Well, it's a little harder for them to say that. And if you've done your research and you found out that the particular area that you're going to work in, maybe you're going to work in the finance sector or the marketing sector of the firm, has done very well, then you can preemptively say, you know, I'm really glad to see that, you know, the finance department of your firm is really doing well. So do research on the company. Figure out your market value. And that's where you've got to do a lot of research to look at different kinds of websites to find out the different salaries, compensation for a job that you would be, you know, skilled at based on your qualifications. What's the external market rate? So what would they pay for a person who's interested in, you know, a director position in this type of industry? Figure out what you want and why. Figure out what your needs are. And then that goes to not only the base salary, but the different types of benefits, what's important with respect to the title, vacation, start date, all those types of things. Now, we want you to do that. You're not necessarily going to get all those things, but it's important to think about all those things and have those planned out. And then what's really important is to figure out your BATNA, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but that's really what is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. That's what that stands for, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What will you do if you don't take that job or you don't take that promotion? What's your best option? Will you keep looking? Do you have another option that you might consider? So there's a lot that's involved in the preparation phase, and that's really why we spend the most time, and you should spend the most time on preparation, because preparation will build your knowledge, it will build your confidence, and it will enable you to negotiate more effectively. Second key point, ask for more than you expect to get. Sometimes people will say, well, I'm just going to ask for the salary at, you know, $80,000 because that's exactly what I want. Remember, negotiation is a little bit of a game in the sense that they're expecting you're going to ask for more than you want. And so if you just said, well, I want 80, and they're going to expect that, well, actually, you really only wanted 75, and they're going to start kind of a quid pro quo discussion back and forth. So it's important to know that you want to ask for more than you're hoping to get just to get what you want. We say start with your MPP, your maximum plausible position. So don't ask for, if the salary is listed as, you know, 80 to 100 and you ask for, you know, 175,000, well, that's an extreme position. And generally when you use extreme positions, the other side gets really upset and they often, you know, don't make anything happen. But if you come up with something that's maximum but plausible, now how will you know what's maximum and plausible? You'll only know if you've done research and you found out that it seems plausible that you could ask for 115 to 125, that seems plausible based on the market data. And that's why that first point of preparation is so critical, so that you can even figure out what an MPP should be. The other point here is it's always beneficial to get them to state the offer first. If we're talking about a job negotiation, we would often encourage you to get a written offer first so that you now know what their position is. And that kind of anchors the conversation, but at least it lets you know what they were thinking when they first made that offer. So that's going to be very important. The next point is to set higher targets. Remember I said that women have the tendency when they finally ask to not ask for as much as men do. And the reason sometimes is that women have a tendency to put their targets pretty low and to think, well, I could just live with 80,000, so that's what I will be thinking is 80,000. And yet, if your range is 80 to 100, then you need to be thinking about the 100, or what we say, think about your top amount, not your bottom amount. Now, let me give you an example about this. If you had a range in mind of 80 to 100, and let's say that was based on the research, and let's say that was a great range to have, it makes really good sense. Maybe 100 is the MPP, so it seems really plausible. But let's say you go into the actual negotiation, whether that's face-to-face or by phone, and in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, if they just give me 80, I'll be fine. If they come in and offer you 77, and you're thinking, well, if I just get 80, I'll be fine, then you'll be pretty happy when you hear the 77 because you'll think, well, that's not very far off from what I was originally thinking. If, on the other hand, you come in and you were thinking of the 100 in your range, remember your range was 80 to 100, and they offer you 77, you're going to say to yourself, wow, 77 is really different from 100. And what you're going to do is you're going to negotiate a little bit harder and hold out a little bit more, maybe push them a little bit to get closer to the 100. So my point about all this is when you set your targets, and you've done this based on research, when you go into the conversation, think about that high number, not about that low number, because you will hold out a little longer, you'll negotiate a little bit stronger. Obviously, if you have any questions, type those in as we're going through. The next point is, and this is one that is really important for women in particular, that you have to consider the goals you have with your negotiation. And we consider those to be both relationship goals and issue goals. So Fisher, Ury, and Patton, who have written a lot on negotiations, particularly the book Getting to Yes, often talk about this distinction between being hard on the problem and soft on the people. And I think that's really important. So what that means is the negotiation is about the job, or it's about, you know, the promotion, or it's about the total compensation, or the responsibilities. And that's the problem. So you can be tough about that problem, but you can still be nice to the person that you're negotiating with. I think sometimes women blur these two, and they think, well, if I am tough on this problem, they'll think I don't like them, or, you know, that'll hurt the relationship. Those are two separate issues. You can be very nice to the person. You can be soft-spoken. You can be very sweet to the person, but you can be tough about the problem. One way to do this that makes it easier for you is sometimes, and you see this in car dealerships a lot, so there's some method to what they do, is sometimes you have things written down on a piece of paper, or you have things that are, so maybe the contract with the company is written down, obviously, or maybe there's something up on a screen or flip chart or something like that. Whenever you do that for any kind of negotiation, you have something written down or put someplace else, what that does is that allows the problem to be over here on a piece of paper, and we can still have our relationship and talk to each other across the way in a nice way. So what you need to do is you need to remember to separate the relationship from the actual issue. The other thing that happens is women have the tendency sometimes to over-identify with the other party. Well, I don't want to ask them for this because I'll hurt their feelings. Well, if I ask for the discount in the store, they might lose money. And I think that's something that we as women have to really be careful about. Do not over-identify with them. They can take care of themselves. And that's what we have to remember, is they're not going to enter a deal that's not going to work for them. So let them take care of themselves and let us take care of ourselves. And that's what that refers to. So I mentioned the BATNA. So this is really powerful in every negotiation that you have, whether it's about a job, whether it's about an assignment, a house, in your personal relationships, anything. You always look at, if I make that deal happen, that's one thing, but if I don't, what's my alternative? And what's my best alternative? So that's why we talk about the BATNA as your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You're either going to make the deal or you're going to follow your BATNA. So with the BATNA, in a job situation, it would be what? It would be another job. So that's why I often tell people it would be in your best interest if you could have multiple job offers at one time. Because if you do, then you're able to leverage them against each other. And let's say you are really interested in a job, but you have another pretty good offer. Then that other pretty good offer is going to be your BATNA. And so what happens is if you have a good alternative, you will negotiate much stronger because you realize, well, if it doesn't work out, I have this other option that's really good. Now, when you're on the job market, sometimes this doesn't happen, where you get one offer and you have no other offers. So what is your BATNA then? At that point, your BATNA is, well, I'm going to have to keep looking. And for some people, that's still attractive because they say to themselves, well, I'm actually really marketable and I feel really confident about myself, and so I feel good about that alternative. Other people that I've talked to often will say, oh, I hate that alternative. I don't want to keep looking, and so I feel really bad about that. Well, the way you view, so in that case, you have maybe two people who have the exact same alternative, staying on the market. One person views it in a very positive light. One person views it in a very negative light. And if you view it in a positive light, you will negotiate stronger. If you view it in a negative light, you will seem more desperate. And you will give in more to the deal, whatever it is, because you don't want to have to go to your alternative. So the whole point about this is just every situation that you're in, just the same as if you were, going to buy a car. You always look at what are my options. You always try to find the most attractive alternative you can. In the job situation, I also say it's really beneficial if you get an offer and it's really early and you still haven't talked to other firms, you can call those other firms that you're very interested in. And maybe you've had one interview with them or just an inquiry. You can call them and say, I'm very interested in your firm. I do have another offer, but I'm very interested in your firm. Can you tell me what the process might be that we could speed some things up, because I do need to give this first firm some, an answer within a certain time period. The benefit of doing that is it tells that second firm that someone else wants you, and generally when someone else wants you, you're seen as more attractive, and it also helps speed up the process. So you can see how the BATNA could be very powerful to use. Now, I do say that you don't throw a BATNA in someone's face, like, oh, well, I have a much better offer than this. You don't generally do it that way. If you have to use it and bring it up, you do it, but you're, of course, going to do that in a really nice way, just by saying, well, I really appreciate the offer that you're giving me. I do have this other alternative, and they have, offered this in terms of their compensation. Is there any way that we can get closer to that other salary over here? So one factor I think that will help you with self-confidence is the preparation. I think we all recognize that, if you're giving a presentation and you've really prepared, you feel very confident. You feel confident when you're presenting. You feel confident when people throw out questions at you. The same thing is true with your negotiations. The more you've prepared, the more research you've done, the more information you've collected, the more self-confidence you'll have. The more self-confidence you have, the stronger you'll be in the negotiation. And go back to my original couple of points, you will ask for more and you'll be more persistent because you feel very confident. So what's very important with a negotiation to build that confidence is preparing, but also practicing. Generally, when I teach negotiations, whether it's with a client or in a class, we do a lot of practice, a lot of skill building, because negotiations is a skill. So that's one of those things that you want to just practice and get feedback from someone. How did you come across? How did you look? Did you look nervous? Did you sound nervous? And also, I would tell you, get feedback from people about how you sound on the phone as well, because many of your negotiations will happen on the phone. You'll start the whole thing out face-to-face with a job interview as an example, but then you might do the actual compensation on the phone. I should also point out, just as an aside, do not do your final negotiations for jobs on email. Email is probably the worst way that you can actually get what you want because people might not respond or answer, and that will destroy your self-confidence as well because you'll be thinking, why haven't they gotten back to me? What's going on? So self-confidence, you only enhance that if you prepare and if you really practice. Now, this is an interesting technique, the VICE technique. So a lot of times what happens is if someone makes us an offer for something, we have the tendency to immediately make a counteroffer. Somebody says, oh, we're going to be offering you $80,000, and you say, well, no, I was really hoping for $85,000. What I would encourage you to do instead is instead of making a counteroffer, which you really don't have to do right away, is just in some situations use what we call the VICE technique, which is just to say, well, actually, I was really looking for something better than that. Now, the reason you do that is because the other party might say, well, here's what we can do. And now they've come up with another alternative. Sometimes, though, if they're pretty savvy, they'll say, well, what did you mean? And they will press you to make a counteroffer. But a lot of times they won't. They will actually just negotiate something better for you. So just think about it. Sometimes it works in compensation, sometimes it doesn't in that context, but it works a lot in everyday situations. So just don't think that you always have to do a counteroffer. Think sometimes of just getting the person to say, what could they do differently? Now, the appropriate style, this really comes in for women in particular. In negotiations, we know that women, people are looking for something in terms of women's behaviors. They expect women to be very nice. They expect women to be very friendly, to be cooperative, to have calm voice and demeanor, more so than they might expect that of men. Now, that doesn't mean that they expect women just to give in, although we do see that because women are not as persistent, sometimes they do think women are going to do that. So what's important is that you can be a very effective negotiator as a woman if you use a social style. I don't like anybody, and sometimes people get worried about this, that if they practice negotiations, they're going to turn into this very aggressive, demanding person. I don't like anybody to turn into that person. I think we're not saying that. We're saying you can still have your friendly, approachable style and a very, that's what we call it, very cooperative, like let's work together style and still get what you want. Simple things. Instead of sitting, like if you're going in for a raise negotiation, instead of sitting across from the person, if you can sit sort of on the corner with them or a little bit more side by side, the idea is that you two are working together to figure this out, to make this work so that you can get the kind of things that are important to you. So the style is going to be important. You know, using an overly aggressive style, people will you know, sort of view women that they shouldn't be doing that type of thing. But I think, you know, they know that women will be very cooperative, and that's a benefit that women have in negotiations. Silence. Silence is one of the most powerful tactics you can use in negotiation. If you're a very extroverted, gregarious person, this is going to be a little bit more of a challenge for you because you have the tendency perhaps to fill in silences or to tell too much or sometimes to interrupt, right? If you're more introverted, this is perhaps one of your benefits, is that sometimes you'll just allow things to go on and you'll listen. So what I would suggest is work on silence if this is not your natural inclination. And by silence, I really mean listen and try to learn what they've told you. Get them to explain why it would be difficult for them to come up with an additional $10,000 in a raise or a salary or something like that. And I like to use phrases like, can you help me understand how that might be a little bit difficult for you to do? And then use silence, say nothing, and just let them talk and listen to what they have to say. Now, I talk about silence as being strategic. And the reason for that is because you don't want to just be totally silent, of course. You want to actually say something or ask a question and then say nothing. Wait for them to respond. Then say something or ask and then say nothing. The other thing that I would say is, let's say you're going to your boss and you want to ask for a raise. and you have 5 reasons why you should get this raise. We often have the tendency to throw out all 5 reasons at once, and that's not such a good strategy. What would be better is to throw out the first reason and then have silence and just let them digest that reason. If that doesn't seem to convince them, then throw out the second reason and then have some silence. And the reason you do this is pretty strategic. It's because by the time you're done, they will have heard multiple reasons for why you deserve this raise. If, on the other hand, you throw out all 5 reasons right away, they will basically have heard one big reason, but they won't see it as all this sort of convincing argument. So hopefully that makes sense. But silence, if you know that that's something you're not strong in, then practice on everyday negotiation situations and get someone to give you feedback on it, because it's incredibly powerful. You learn a lot from the other party, which you can then use to your benefit, and it also shows that you're really listening and caring about what they have to say. Okay, so another principle, set it aside. One of the things that happens sometimes in a negotiation is we have the tendency to try to deal with all the difficult issues right away. And that may not be the best strategy. So one of the things that could be to your benefit is actually start with the issues that are the simplest issues, the things that you and the other party are going to agree on. So if it's in a raise, or let's say you had an internship and now you're going back for an offer, you could certainly say, well, we both agree that my performance has been, really stellar for this past year, because let's say you have the ratings in front of you, and that we both agree that I'm really committed to this firm and I'm very interested in, being successful and helping the firm achieve its success. Start with things that you both would agree on, and if there's smaller things that you can negotiate, you can start with those types of things. Once you get to more difficult things and you realize you and the other party don't necessarily agree on that. So let's say you want this large raise and they say that's going to be difficult to do. Then you can say, well, why don't we just set that aside and we'll come back to that. And then tackle some other things first. The reason you do that is because then when you get back to that issue, you and the other party will have already agreed on some things, and you'll feel a sense of momentum, and you'll want to tackle the difficult issue. If, on the other hand, you tackle the difficult thing first, and you and the other party don't agree whatsoever, and you are butting heads on this, then what you might do is just say, well, forget it. We're not going to reach any agreement on anything, so let's just not even talk about it. And that's often what happens. So what's key here, a couple of things. One, start with the simplest things first you think you might reach agreement on. Second, when you reach difficult things that you see that there's conflict, set them aside, and what you may do is come back to them at a later time. You could make some sort of change in, the whole process, maybe use some sort of humor, take a break. Taking a break is very powerful. A lot of times people do not do that because they think, no, we just have to stay until it's all over. And they stay in that conversation until the whole conversation is over. But often that may not be in your best interest. So for job negotiation in particular, I see this a lot. You ask for something, and the HR person or the recruiter says, well, we're not going to be able to do that. So you may be able to say, well, can you just check with the hiring manager, because this is really important to me. They may say, well, okay, but I'm going to have to go do that. It's in your best interest at that point to say, well, that would be great. I really appreciate it if you could do that. That's essentially taking a break from the conversation, because they're going to go off and they may, and you should set up, okay, so we should set up a call to talk again. When do you think? Within the next 3 days or within a week? Then you get back to the negotiation. So you've essentially taken a break, and that's been to your best interest to let them go off and see if they could make something happen for you. Making time your ally. So this is an interesting sort of dynamic. In most negotiations, and if you just reflect on this, I think you'll see that, wow, this has really happened a lot. Most negotiations will be resolved at near the end of the time. If you have an hour to do a negotiation, a lot of times the decisions will be made in the last 5 or 10 minutes. If you have 30 minutes, it'll be in the last 5 or 10 minutes. If you have 3 hours, it'll be in the last 5 or 10 minutes. And that often happens because people are influenced by time. Now, what I would suggest to you is a couple things. One, if you know that you're a very time-oriented person, maybe some of you have done something like the Myers-Briggs and you know you're a J type on the Myers-Briggs where you like things to be structured and organized and you're very sensitive to time. Okay, we have 2 hours for this negotiation. That is a little different than a person who, now go back to the Myers-Briggs, who is on the P, perceiving side, who says, well, we have 2 hours, but if it takes more, that's fine. If it takes less, that's fine. They're very relaxed about time. Put those two kind of people in a negotiation and what happens? The person who's very concerned about time will be the one to usually give in at the end because they're looking at their watch or phone and they're saying, wow, I only have so much time left. I need to make this happen. The person who's very relaxed will just allow it to happen. They will see that the other person is very pressed by time because they're watching them watch their phone or look at their watch or being stressed. And so they'll allow them to just concede things near the end. So the reason I bring this up is because you have to have patience. Sometimes I've seen people when they get their job, their salary offers or their written offers, and the firm says, well, get back to us in 3 weeks. And sometimes I've seen people where they will say, well, you know, Dr. Russell, I need to go ahead and let them know within 2 days. And I'll say, well, what did they say? And they'll say 3 weeks. And I'll say, well, then you have 3 weeks. Don't rush to make a decision about something until you've really done everything that you need to do. Don't use your own time pressure to stress you, right? If the firm gave you that time, then take the time. Look for other offers in the meantime, do your research in the meantime, and then call them back when it gets closer to the time. But just be careful about use time to help you. If you're a very time-pressed person, that will be one of your biggest challenges for you in a negotiation. You will be so pressed about time that sometimes you will concede near the end. Now, if you see that the other person is very pressed by time, then sometimes you can take advantage of that fact. You know that they're going to probably give in near the end. It's very important not to reveal your timelines. This is where sometimes when we do global negotiations, we get ourselves into trouble. We go over to another country and we say, well, we have 2 weeks to make this deal happen. And they know that. So what do? They wine and dine us for 13 days. And then they know on the last day, we're going to be really pressed and we're going to give in to a lot of things. So just be aware that time can really be a factor. Watch the most dangerous moment. And this goes to the previous point. Once you get close to the end of time, be cognizant of the fact that you may get kind of weak. And this goes back to my original point about being persistent. Sometimes we get close to the end of time and women will just give in because they think, okay, well, we've already agreed on all these things, we're running out of time, and they say, well, can't you just do this? And you're like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So just be careful that, remember, at the end of time, a lot of times the other party will try to get you to give in to things. So look at it as an example of you're in a retail establishment and you're getting ready to check out. That's near the end of time. And remember all those situations where they may say to you, oh, and by the way, did you want that extra warranty? And you weren't even thinking about that. They're trying to get you to agree to something else at the end of time. So just be cautious of that, and you have to remain firm so that even though you might be tired, you've been in the car dealership for, 3 hours and you're tired at the end, or you've been in the salary negotiation for a couple of weeks, don't give in to those last-minute nibbles by the other side. Watch yourself. And then using your walkaway power. So the only way that the walkaway power has power is if you have a good alternative. So go back to our point about the BATNA. If you have a good alternative, then you'll feel very confident being able to walk away. But as soon as you can't walk away, I have to have that house. I have to have this job. I have to have, you no longer will have any power in the negotiation whatsoever. So that's why it's so important to be able to have a good alternative, or to at least feel confident so that they believe you have a good alternative. Otherwise, you won't have what we call walk-away power, and they'll know it. And they'll know that basically you're just going to give in to whatever it is they say. And then finally, one of the points that I mentioned is practicing your negotiation. I think this is so important. Just like you would go in if you're giving a speech to, 100 people or 200 people or 10 people, you would sort of think about, what am I going to say in the very beginning? How am I going to script that out? Remember, the very first things that you say and do really influence your own confidence. If you start out really strong in the first 5 minutes, you'll feel very confident later on. The same thing with a negotiation, particularly with a job. Script out what you're going to say when you call them to have the discussion about the compensation or to have the discussion about the job responsibilities. Think through what you're going to say. Practice with somebody else who plays the other role so that they can, actually give you practice, and they can say, well, now they're going to say this. And then you can say, well, this is what I would say next. Actually role play it out and get someone to observe and give you feedback. It's amazing what people can tell you. They can say, well, I noticed when we were talking that you never gave me good eye contact, so I figured you weren't very confident in your position. Or I noticed that you stumbled over what you were saying. I noticed that you were confident until you mentioned the numbers, and then you were not confident. So practice is critical. As I mentioned before, it helps to build your self-confidence, so it's very important. So those are the tips. I will say that if the other party throws out what we call dirty tricks or competitive tactics, they bully you, or they tell you, well, we have a lot of other people interested in this job, which is called the power of competition, and that stresses us often. Or they play good cop, bad cop, one person is telling you great things, the other person's not. What you can do when you see those kinds of tactics is, first, it would be great if you, learn what some of those tactics are, but you can either just ignore them as if they didn't occur. You can use your own tactics back, which I actually don't advocate because it just gets into this whole vicious cycle of people using sort of competitive tactics. You can confront them and say, it seems like you threw out a pretty unrealistic offer. Can you throw out something that you think might be a little bit more plausible? What you're doing there is you're confronting them with a tactic. Or my favorite strategy, I think, is to co-opt them. If you know somebody's going to throw out some tactic that might be a little underhanded, then in advance try to befriend them, because it's a little less likely that they will do that to a friend. And then, the last thing I just want to say, and then we want to open this up to questions, of course, is talking to a number of women who've been through the process. They said, what kinds of things, I'm very successful now, what would I wish I would have known to be more successful going forward? First, they said, well, I wish I'd had more mentors. And that's a whole other webinar, but that's really important, is getting people that you can actually talk to and say, look, this is what I'm experiencing on the job market. What do you think about this? Building your professional networks. Now, obviously, you're all part of this Forte webinar, which is fabulous. So this is part of your network that you're creating, which is a wonderful thing that you're doing. They've also said, I need to be more proactive. I wished I had been more proactive in showcasing and seeking credit. This is another big issue for women. Sometimes I like people, because I teach a lot on leadership, I like people to use the we term a lot instead of I. However, there are times when it's important to say I. This is what I did to, if you're looking at a raise negotiation or you're looking for a job situation, you have to at sometimes make sure that people know that you are the one that did certain kinds of things. And they also mentioned they wish they had spent more time negotiating and practicing. So with that, that's gone through a lot of points pretty quickly. One thing I mentioned is that we're never going to get all the things we want, but what we do know is that if you don't ask, you're not going to get probably any of the things that you want. So asking is very important. That's really pretty critical. The fact that you're here already in this webinar gives you a lot of credit that you're trying to take charge of your career, I would encourage you, of course, to network, continue networking with others, figuring out what is it that you should be asking for, making sure that you're asking for more, and then being persistent to keep asking. And with that, I'll certainly open it up to questions.
Great, thank you, Joyce. So we've got a couple of questions here and there, so let me find one I've got here. So Stacy asks, in terms of getting a written offer first, what strategy should be utilized when an interviewer asks what salary is expected prior to an offer being given?
That's a great question. That question comes up a lot as well. Employers do have the tendency to ask you, well, what are you currently making, or what were you previously making? I really try to encourage, and a lot of times they'll do this in the first interview, and that's very nerve-wracking for people because they're not expecting it. So I tell people, expect that question to come up even from the first conversation. Have done your market research so that if you feel really pressed to give them some answer, that you will give them a range. Make sure you're comfortable with the bottom number on the range because that may be where they start. But I also encourage people, try to deflect the question and not directly answer that because it's not in your best interest to answer that before you get a written offer. And the reason I say that is because they don't even know if they want you yet. You don't even know if you want to go to work for them yet. When you get a written offer, you know that they want you. And that's when you have your most leverage. So if you do get those questions before the written offer, I would encourage you to try to deflect. Just say, well, I'm sure we'll come up with something that's reasonable. Can we talk more about, I'd love to hear more about the nature of the work that I'd be doing. You said I'd be working with this group over here. I'm really excited to hear more about it. I like people to just say, I'm open, I'm willing to negotiate that, and talk about that, you know, a little bit later, but I'd like to learn more about the job or the people first.
Okay, great. Here's another one from Kayla. When using the VICE technique, if they respond with a better offer, do you then use that as a negotiation starting point, or should you expect their best and final at that point?
So if you use it and let's say they threw out a number in the beginning and then you said, well, I'm really looking for something a little different than that, and they throw out something else again, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably whatever they've thrown out the second time, that's probably where their starting point is. And at that point, and we're assuming you've already gotten an offer, that you've had this conversation, then at that point, you would use that as the starting point. So I would, if that's not something you feel good about, then I would say, well, can you help me understand a little bit how you arrive at that? Because, you know, I've done some research, and my research has really indicated this range over here. I also like to use ranges as opposed to fixed numbers because ranges show more flexibility. But that's, yeah, you're going to have to use that now as sort of their anchoring the conversation there. And what you want to do is instead of anchoring the conversation on what you're currently making or what you previously made, particularly if you now got an MBA or an advanced degree of some sort, you want to anchor it based on what the market says. So you could say, you know, I appreciate your, you know, suggesting that. Can you help me understand how you arrive at that? Let them talk a little bit and then say, well, you know, I did some market research and the market sort of suggests that this would be the range that might be more appropriate for this position, and then say nothing and see what they say to that.
Here's another one. If an employer says something is non-negotiable, for example, paid time off, should you believe them, or is anything negotiable?
That's a great question. And there is variance in employers in terms of what's negotiable and what's not. So this is where your preparation is really important. If you've already talked to some people, maybe internally, maybe you have some alums from where you went to school that you can talk to internally, and they can say to you, well, you know, they say it's non-negotiable, but it really is. Or they can say, well, they say it's non-negotiable and it really isn't negotiable. They're telling you the truth. That will give you some insight because otherwise you really don't know. There are things that you can just tell from the way in which they say that. You know, one of the things that's also helpful is sometimes an employer says something's non-negotiable and we never ask why. So you can always say, when they say, well, the signing bonus is not negotiable, and you can just say, well, can you help me understand that a little bit? Because I know there's a lot of variants that firms use in terms of signing bonuses, and I was just curious. Remember, the tone and style that you use needs to be a soft tone. It needs to be a nice tone. And you can ask those questions just so you understand why that's not negotiable. And what are they going to say? They're going to say just the usual kinds of things would be, well, that's our standard thing, you know, and that's what we typically offer. Sometimes they don't know what to say because they're not the one making the decision. They're just relaying the decision. But I think that you can at least try to understand it. And then if you feel like, okay, they're not going to move on that, then you're going to be looking at some other factors.
Okay, great. Here's another one. Is it better to raise potential objections yourself and address them right away, or wait for the other party to bring them up?
So I'm assuming those are potential objections about yourself as a candidate for the job?
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's what I would look like.
Okay. Well, it depends on what those are. If you, maybe they say to you, we have a couple of finalists, and you're one of those finalists, you might be able to say something to the effect of, so are there some, you know, other aspects that I can help you with that you need more information about, or that you need more information from my references about? So you're trying to get a feel for, are there objections? And without necessarily stating anything, are there any kind of objections, and how can you potentially counter them? Now, sometimes they'll say, no, 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 we have that covered and we'll figure it out. Or sometimes they might say, well, we're just trying to understand more about your experience with this particular aspect. Then you at least have a feel for what those are. I think it depends on what the issue is, though. If you know that you're not particularly strong in one aspect of the job, or you think they're worried that you're not going to be able to travel, then I would probably be preemptive and say, you know, I know there's a lot of traveling associated with this job. I'm very comfortable with traveling associated with this job, unless, of course, you're not. And you can say, and, you know, even though my last job did not require that, I, you know, really feel comfortable with the amount of traveling that's going to be associated. Sometimes women get worried about their family situation, and you're trying to figure out what are they asking by certain questions. So if you think they're asking, you know, you have, let's say somehow they know you have, you know, small children at home, and you're worried, well, they're going to think that I can't travel or I can't work nights or weekends, then I think you can be preemptive to say, you know, I've gotten everything, you know, really taken care of, and I feel very comfortable being able to travel, work on the weekends, and that sort of thing, without directly identifying the issue.
Okay, great. So there's one more question here. If anyone wants to ask any more questions, please go ahead and get them typed in the Q&A section. But this is from Noy. She asked, what if the HR person who manages the offer negotiation process is not the person who interviewed you? And for example, you built a relationship with the interviewer, but that's not the person who is making the offer and is negotiating with you. And
right,
on how to handle that.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Sometimes, well, what I tell people is when you get the written offer, that's signed by somebody. So that's the person you start the conversation with. Sometimes that's the HR person, and it's not, as you're saying, it's not the person you actually interviewed or the hiring manager. But you have to start the conversation there because that HR person is a gatekeeper, and they are, you know, just for common courtesy. So you could start the conversation with them, and you could say, you know, I'd like to set up this conversation with respect to the offer, and have the conversation with them. And they may say, well, you know, there's nothing we can do, or we're going to go check. If you feel like you're not getting anywhere with them, you can always say, and you know that the hiring manager really needs you and wants you, because they're the ones that usually really want you to start the job, because they're the desperate ones that need you to do the work. So you can say, well, is there any way that maybe the three of us could meet, yourself and whoever the person is, because, you know, from conversations with them, I know we really want to get started on working on these projects, and I would really love for all of us to have that conversation. The reason you do that is, first off, you're keeping the HR person in the loop, And I think that's very important. You never go around that person. That's just not a good thing to do. And you're keeping them in the loop, but you're also saying, you know, this is actually important to me, and I'd like to bring that person in the conversation. And they may say, well, no, we don't have to do that. I'll go and talk to that person. Or they may say, well, sure, we can do that. But often you sort of, you know, let them know that you have a good relationship with that person and that, you know, you would like that person to be involved. The other thing that happens sometimes is sometimes that hiring manager will just email you or be in touch with you saying, well, how's everything going and how do you feel about the offer? And if that's the case, because they're the ones that, once again, they really want something to happen, and you may say, well, you know, you could follow up with them and say, well, you know, I have gotten the offer and I appreciate that. There are some things I'm still trying to work out as it relates to the compensation. They may try to get involved and say, well, you know, is there something I can do? And you might say, well, I'm, you know, going to have the conversation with the HR person. You know, if you'd like to be part of that, you might want to let them know. So what you're doing is you're just trying to let them know, because more than likely they'll go back to the HR person and they'll say, what's the holdup here? You know, I really need this person, and what do we need to make happen here? So that can be to your benefit.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions yet. So, Joyce, I know you have a few more slides to cover real quick, and we'll see if anything else comes through.
Okay, so really, I think I don't have too many more things. I mean, I just pointed out that there's a lot of great resources there. And I would encourage you to I think I've identified a couple different sets of resources that I would encourage you to just look through, because, once again, the more that you read up on this area, a little bit of it can depress you, I think, when you find out that, you know, that women sometimes don't negotiate, or they don't negotiate as strong, or they're not as persistent. You know, that part depresses you a little until you say, okay, but what is it that I can do? And if you're able to even use any of these tips that I've pointed out, I think that's really helpful. You know, I think sometimes, and it sounds strange, but sometimes it's, you know, it's beneficial to say, well, what would a guy do in this situation? Because I think he would probably push a little bit harder. I think he would probably ask for some additional things. And I think the other key thing is just to remember something that I pointed out is we have to be really careful not to feel, you know, this sense of guilt for doing this. Remember that we're separating the relationship from the issue. The other thing that you should realize is that even if you don't get all the things you want, which you probably won't, but if you get a couple of those things, I tell people to think about the top 3 things that are most important to you. I encourage people to really push hard for base salary because it impacts everything that happens. Your performance bonuses, your retirement, everything's based on a percentage of your base salary. So I encourage people to focus on that. And then there may be 1 or 2 things. It could be the start date. It could be vacation time. You know, what's important to you. But think about those. Maybe you have a list of 15 things, but you're not going to get all 15 things unless you just are really well niched in an industry and you're the only one who knows something about an area. But think about the top couple of things, and even if you just get a couple of those, one of the things, and you go to work for that firm, one of the things you've also done is you've helped them see that this is serious to you and that when you're up for a raise, that you will come prepared again. And sometimes just knowing that, they will have more respect for you, and they will also say, well, okay, when this person comes in again, I know they're going to be really well prepared, and they're going to know that they're going to have, you know, all their sort of research behind something. And that's to your benefit because they view you in a very positive light. I should also point out that the research does show that for jobs, those who negotiate in an assertive manner are viewed much more positively by employers than those who don't negotiate at all and those who negotiate in a very aggressive fashion. So especially if you're looking at consulting jobs, which maybe some of you are, they're expecting you're going to negotiate because they believe if you can't negotiate with them, then why would you negotiate on your job to help the firm? So you want to think about those kind of factors.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions. Well, thank you, Joyce, for sharing all of your knowledge and experiences with us today. We really appreciate it. We're actually looking forward to having Joyce lead a session on negotiating at our Forte MBA Women's Leadership Conference coming up on June 17th and 18th in Austin, Texas. Our registration is currently open, so please visit the website to learn more about that. Again, thank you everyone for listening today, and we hope you continue to take advantage of all of the resources the Forte Foundation has to offer. So have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.